Welcome to Behind the Wines, a freshly bottled podcast about Australian wine, the wines we love, and the people behind them. My mission is simple. I want to get down into the cellar with sommeliers, stomp some grapes with winemakers, and have chats with our finest critics, growers, retailers, and chefs. Our guest is one of the most influential figures in Australian wine, Andrew Gard, who is warmly referred to by many as the Godfather. Andrew has a reputation for discovering cult wines and backing independent producers. His fearless palate and uncompromising standards have shaped what's poured in restaurants and cellars across the country and how we drink and think about wine. His mission has remained clear: to connect people with wines that speak honestly, beautifully, and with purpose. So welcome to Behind the Wines, Andrew.
Thank you, Brent. Nice to be here, mate.
You said you weren't always interested in wine. Can you take us back to how it all began?
Well, when I left school, my friends, my father, and all my sort of peers were beer drinkers, really. In the early 90s, young people weren't really drinking that much wine. And when I left school, I decided to take on catering instead of university. So I did the hotel school at the Intercontinental. And part of that was food and beverage sales and service. And by learning that, I got introduced to wine. We had wine programs there, and the outlets that we worked in when we weren't studying sold wine. And I met a group of people whilst I was working there that weren't part of the hotel school, but were obviously working in the hotel. And those guys were, further along in their career and had developed tastes for wine and had visited certain wine areas and were quite sort of skilled at being able to describe wine and knew where it was from. And I found the whole thing fascinating. So, I guess it was from there. So probably from about 18 on, or more like probably 19, I got the wine bug, but it was through my work.
And Andrew, was there a moment or bottle that made you fall in love with the wine?
Probably early on, there were two moments that I can remember distinctly. The first wine was I found a bottle of wine in a bottle shop in Wahroonga that was famous for a guy called Joe Speziali. Had a wine store down there right near the station. And it was a bit like a Charles Dickens, like Aladdin's Cave kind of shop. And, half the stickers were falling off the bottles. But there were some bargains to be had. And I found this 1982 Gevrey Chambertin from a guy called Denny Bachelet. And I bought it. It would have only cost $50, whatever. But it was a lot for me. And I remember drinking that. And I thought, wow, how can wine be so complex? It really was a sensual delight in many ways. And then the second one was a few years after that with my great old mentor, Tony Bilson, who was one of Australia's greatest chefs, wine, at a time when chefs didn't necessarily always know much about wine. They were there to cook, and then they had sommeliers and maitre d's, and that was how it worked. But he did, and he poured like a Seppelt's Paraport from 1870 into my palm, and it poured out like treacle, and just a little pool of it gathered in my palm. I licked it, and it was like ambrosia. And that was in his house when he used to live in Wallara years and years ago. And that was another moment that I thought, geez, how can it be like this? So probably those two, I'd say.
So Treasury Restaurant and Tony Bilson clearly have left a mark on you.
Yeah.
What was that early sommelier experience like for you?
Well, in those days, there were only a handful of sommeliers at that time. There would have been, I could probably name them, but it's a bit early in the morning, but there would have been, say, 4 or 5 working in Sydney in the top restaurants. And it was definitely something that was it was an embryonic part of sommelier. There was a course that I started called the Introduction to Sommelier that was started by TAFE by a guy called Clive Hartley. That was in 1995, I believe. So as far as I'm aware, that was the first actual course that you could do, well, in Sydney anyway, towards becoming a sommelier. And I took that. But I mean, that just shows you how far it's come, really. There were only 14 or 15 people in that group. One was a publican, I remember. Some are restaurateurs, some young guys and young girls like me. But it's come a long way since like 94, 95.
And what about being on floor, so to speak?
Oh, yeah.
What was that like, and what did that...
Oh, it was a bit daunting in the beginning because the place that I worked with in the beginning, the Treasury, had a wine list that was compiled in 1987 by this Italian guy, I understand, and the Intercontinental, which opened then, spent vast amounts of money procuring this wine from all around the world and Australia, and most of it was actually under strict lock and key down in the basement of the hotel, and you had to get security to go down with you to get the bottles if they were ever ordered from the list. But this was, it was a leather-bound Bible of, it must have been seriously 100 pages, and a lot of the names of the wines, I had no idea what they meant. We did have our manager, Willie Pettigrew, who's still a great mate of mine. I saw him yesterday. He he was my maitre d' and the manager, and he knew about the wines. He knew where they were from and could sell them. But, there was a lot of other people working in the restaurant there that didn't. And that once again shows you how far things have come.
And why did you choose to focus on importing rather than producing wines?
That's an interesting question. A lot of people have said that to me over the years, and I guess it's because I've probably worked out that I'm quite an impatient person. Making wine requires quite a lot of diligence and a lot of work that's quite the same a lot of the time. So I think pruning and, training vines, working the soil, it's a labor that I don't think I'd be very good at. It's time consuming and quite repetitive. It's not how I think I can represent wine best. And I think if I wanted to do something, I'm not sure if I'd be able to live up to my own standards. So I think it's easier for me to love other people's work in that sense. Having said that, I would definitely maybe one day do a collaboration effort with a winemaker around some kind of an idea, which I think would end up being some sort of a blending thing between the two friends rather than, growing grapes and making wine. I'm more of a salesman. I'm a taster first and foremost. So I guess I'm a gastronome in that sense, with loving the taste of things. And so I guess I've taken my love of how things taste and how things came to be into a more of a sales and communication role rather than a producer role.
Flowing from that, so how did Andrew Gard Wine Imports come to life, and what was the vision?
Well, at the beginning, I read a book called The Wild Bunch, Great Wines from Small Producers by a guy called Patrick Matthews, and read that in about I think it was published in 95. I think I read it in 97. And the narrative of that book was that it was the path to market in the UK through the Oddbins chain mostly, which was an independent liquor chain in the 90s, about artisan wineries in France and how they became sort of known in the UK. And Matthews was very interesting to me because his scores for quirkiness and weirdness instead of just analytically looking at the wines. And so he almost scored wines for being different and interesting from small regions that we hadn't heard of before. And it struck a chord in me because of my training in Australia was very, very technical and structured. And I'm happy that it was, but this was another vocalization of wine. And it's sung to me because it also made me realize how far away from the world we were here, and that there were many other things for me to discover in wine. And that despite me throwing myself into things fully here, there was still a whole world of things to discover. And so I had these producers that sounded so interesting to me in my mind. And I won a competition in 1998, which allowed me to travel to France. They gave me a ticket to travel there. And by complete happenstance, I was walking to a meeting that had been organized through the Champagne House. And as I was walking to this restaurant to meet with the world's best sommelier at the time, I walked past this amazing looking store, and it was very, very, it looked like it had been there 150 years. And I found out that it had, just so much character in there. Anyway, I'd noticed a couple of the labels of the bottles, and I thought, place stock some of these wines I've got in my head from this book. Anyway, after I finished the meeting, I crossed back over the road and I knocked on the door, walked in, and there was a guy there that spoke English, because I couldn't speak French at that time. And he said, come in. And he had a leather apron on and, had a bunch of grapes. And he said, well, sit down, we can open some bottles. And I said, well, these are the ones I want to try. And I told him about the book. So he opened those. And he knew about Australia, knew about Tetsuya's restaurant in Sydney. And he'd had Mount Mary and he drank Jasper Hill and Bass Phillip. And I thought, geez, it was pretty cool. So, and that time that was a sort of a light bulb moment for me about, maybe one day I could bring some of these wines into Australia and share them with the Australians, because I'm pretty sure they'd like them. But I wasn't in a position financially at that point in time to do that. I mean, in 1998, I was still working as a sommelier, and I didn't until 2000. So, I was living week to week, month to month, really, my rent obligations and my lifestyle and stuff. I didn't have money to go and start a business like that. But I never told anyone about my idea, and I never shared anyone those wineries. So I was gatekeeping that for myself for the future. And that came 10 years later. So I'd worked for a business called Torbreck Vintners in the Barossa Valley as a national sales and marketing manager. And that paid me well, which I was able to save from. And it also enabled me to meet a group of people from all around Australia. I was selling wines to every state in Australia, big hotels, chains, the multiples, all the way down to tiny restaurants. And so I wasn't only just able to save some money, I developed a huge network, a sales network. So 10 years down the track, then I was ready. And I made a plan to go to France to contact those producers and others that I discovered over the last 10 years. And that's how it started. So in 2007, 10 years after I more or less read that book, I began the company.
From that, what was your vision for that? So what was it going to be that was going to separate you?
The people who had already been importing wines into Australia had concentrated on the most famous regions, the most well-known regions, and the most celebrated producers, but also then producers that were commercially known and could supply consistent wines in commercial volumes, such that someone investing in that from a little bit of an arm's length would be able to keep the market happy here. I'm not going to say there was a lot of color around at that point in time. We were well serviced, but there was certainly a lot of scope and a lot of space to bring things in that I think would add what chefs would say, adding spice to food, to add color and to add dimension into what was already here. I knew that I had some wines that would be significant in that sense. And certainly some regions that I've concentrated on were almost not represented at all, like the Beaujolais, like the Jura, like some parts of the Loire, like the Savoie, some parts of the Rhone. So areas like that we were able to almost pioneer.
You've been called a pioneer of new style wine importing. Well, what does that mean to you?
Well, the early days, it was more difficult. If you think there was no internet in the early days, I say the early days, but I really just mean, in the 80s and most of, in the 90s, really. There was no internet, so you were really working by fax. You didn't have translation tools, and you would need quite a lot of infrastructure behind you as a business. You'd probably need to hire an outside firm to handle your accounts and manage your money. Things were hard, like getting business cards, logos, patents, insurance. It's a lot of work. And I think that you'd need bank letters of credits, and just everything was quite longhand. And the internet's really made things a lot easier. I mean, I still had to use the fax a little bit, but you could use translation tools now. You can design things on the internet in 5 minutes and have them printed and delivered the next week. Bank transfers can be done on your phone if you want them to. There's a lot of things that have changed to make business faster and easier. There's logistics solutions that exist now that you can run from your phone. The other side of that, the new style wine importing, is to take smaller volumes of things and bring them into a market with lots of dimensions. So Sydney and Melbourne have huge layers in there in what they offer now in terms of bars and restaurants. That both cities have got lots of different layers. And so it's not that you would bring in a container of 2 or 3 wines and then go into the 5-star hotels and go and sell them and so forth. This is more a smaller attack, if you know what I mean.
I've heard in the industry, and it kind of amused me, you've got the nickname The Godfather. Can you just tell us, the audience, how did that come about?
Well, I guess in a sense, starting when I did, and I'm 51 this year, and starting when I did in the early 90s, and then starting my business in 2007, maybe I have been a bit of a pioneer in some way when it comes to importing fine wine, small volumes from artisan producers into the hands of the consumers in Australia, in professional and also private capacity. So maybe that's why they call me that. I'm not a guru.
I thought maybe because you make offers winemakers can't refuse, is it?
Well, I feel pretty privileged to work with all the people I do. Most of the wines that we bring in are allocated because we aren't able to buy quite as much as the market wants here. And we go there and bid for more. But quite often when wines are popular somewhere, they're immediately known somewhere else because of social media. So all of a sudden, a wine that you can discover or you think you have a lead on or an edge on can be blown up completely. Next thing you know, some guy in Brazil saying it's great, some guy in Switzerland, Italian, a Swedish, a Japanese, bang, all of a sudden something's gone from relatively unknown, now everybody wants it. So it's the cult of social media that has also affected the popularity of certain wines.
You often say taste first. Can you explain your philosophy around that?
Well, the philosophy around that's one that I've kind of borrowed. Taste is everything to me because realistically, people have a lot of faith in you when they purchase your wine. A lot of my wines are very expensive. And so I'm very thankful that people sometimes buy them without having tasted them and sometimes have to because they wouldn't have heard of them before. So the fact that they do trust me to bring in something consistent, even if they haven't heard of it before, that does mean a lot to me. And I can't take that for granted. So I really do have to be quite stringent on the way things taste. They definitely have to taste of incredibly high quality, but they have to have a taste that's pleasing to me and my style and what I bring into the country. And I will say this, we have the obligation in Australia to have a back label on the rear of each bottle, which has all the mandatory requirements for Australia, including preservatives, addresses, produce of whichever country and so forth, lot codes and things like that. And so on the front of the label is the winery's name. It might be obscure. It might be illegible in a foreign language. It could be a cuvee name that you've never heard of before, but on the back is my name, where where the warehouse is and so forth. And I think sometimes for me, the back label is just as important as the front label, because quite often when people turn around, if they see that it's from me or another one of the wine importers that they trust, they might buy it, even if they don't quite know what's on the front. They like the look of it, they like the sound of it, or they may have heard of it. So it becomes a little bit of kind of a a guarantee of quality in a way. So I have to be careful to protect it.
And how do you find a great wine? Is it about balance, story, or something else?
A great wine for me needs to taste great first. If it also comes from somewhere that has amazing history, from an old family with generations of input, if it comes from some storied history or, pre-wars and things like that, then of course people do get very, passionate about things like that. But there could be a great wine producer farming on a hill on the side of Greece, some Certico that's just begun, that has the touch, that has the knack. Some people are born with it. You can see cooks that can cook brilliantly at 30 years old, winemakers too, just have the feeling and the knack. So sometimes you have this storied history, like in Burgundy, Bordeaux, or Champagne, and then sometimes you have a young person's super dynamic energy. Sometimes, in the Canary Islands in Spain, like I said, or Greece, or at the end of Sicily. And you just really need to take an open mind, taste analytically, see if it fits into you, into your story, and you think you can sell it. You need to be able to sell it too. That's the hard thing. Wine's easy to buy, hard to sell when you're a wholesaler.
What makes a wine hi-fi in your book, even if it's using lo-fi technique?
So lo-fi techniques are effectively artisan wine techniques. So that means that the wines are handled very gently in the cellar. Sometimes they're racked by gravity. They're settled and bottled without filtration, and sometimes don't have much or no preservatives. A hi-fi result is when a wine that's using lo-fi techniques can have an incredibly high success in taste, aroma, complexity, balance, and these things. So it is possible to make a wine using very basic techniques and have such a huge quality level. But what I don't like so much is when people espouse using very lo-fi techniques, but then the quality is not there. So I think sometimes people try to use that as a sales tool. But I'm only using very, very low basic techniques. But then if the wine doesn't taste great, then maybe you should change.
So essentially there's like a fine line between minimal intervention and lazy winemaking.
I think so. Yeah.
So you're known for supporting artisan and natural winemakers. Why is that important to you?
Well, because it's the scale that I work at. I've got lots of friends and colleagues that make big quantities of fine wines that the general consumers can find, but I've always decided to work on a smaller scale, and I guess that's my fascination runs towards work small cellars with small volumes of wine. And quite often the key to great wine is often terroir, which is a concept which I find interesting, and sometimes terroir is limited in area. Sometimes the parcels that the winemakers own within that area are very small. It's limited based on availability of the land size, and so you can't overproduce to make quality. And we don't really have many people we know with huge, vast tracts of great land. Some of it is mere 3 or 4 barrels. Some of it 10 barrels. Some of it 20 barrels, but not more than that. I don't think I work with anyone that has more than 20 or 30 barrels of a particular area. I'm pretty certain.
And so how do you discover the new producers you work with? Is it instinct, taste, travel, or combination?
In the beginning, it was reading books. It was mostly all books. And I would get as many books as I could. And you need to kind of get a feeling for what you like. And then kind of, it's a funny thing. You've got to try to sort of work out within all those books, what's interesting to me, and taste as well. So to be able to go to France, to go and taste the wines, to buy bottles of wines that you don't know about, sometimes it's disappointing, but you need to do it. You've got to get through as much tasting as you can. Then after that, the books became a little bit less relevant and the internet took over big time. There were lots of websites and lots of critics online talking about wine. People were publishing online. And so I would look at those as well. And then obviously following the internet now, social media is a lot. I won't say that I don't get a lot in my feeds of new producers, of other wine importers like me, small wine importers around the world who we follow each other and know each other actually. And, they'll say, this is great, Andrew, you should check this out. And sometimes I'll actually say, I've made a huge discovery that I think is great. And I think someone who's a good friend who works hard, I'll tell them, hey, look, why don't you look at these? They're great. So there's a bit of, how would you say it, collegiate friendliness around the world with sharing some tips on that sort of thing. That can certainly help. But it's sort of gone from books to and all that is online. But then my other way of doing it, which I think a lot of my colleagues do too, is completely by happenstance. If you walk into shops around the world, if you think, yeah, this place looks interesting, you walk in, you might talk to the owner, you might be in a part of town that you don't know, and they say, oh man, if you like this, you should check this out. This is really good. Well, I'll normally buy that bottle, take it home, try it. And in the other ways, restaurants are always a great way to discover new wines, because if you're eating in a good restaurant anywhere in the world and the wine list and the bar looks fairly well considered, then they have obviously gone through and trawled through all the stuff that's been available to them, and they've made a hard selection choice to offer their guests. And so that's often a nice way to say, hey, I'm in this local area, the local food's great, and I'm pretty sure these guys have made a hard selection on the wine, so I can try as many of those by the glass as I can to try things. And restaurants are often another good place to uncover some gems.
What's one recent discovery you're particularly excited about?
I think the last thing that I discovered that I think is really great. A couple of years ago, I started working with this guy in the Jurançon, which is in southwest France, but on the sort of the Biarritz side. And the guy, his name's Jean-Baptiste Saint-Martin, and he used to be on the French fencing team, and he actually came to Sydney for the Olympics. He was a reserve there and liked Australia, and he did some stages in Burgundy, and then he befriended an old farmer who had a small amount of very beautiful old vines in a very nice area in the Jurançon. And this guy started making wines. I think his first vintage was in 16 or 17, and I quickly started working with him after his first or second vintage. And it was in COVID that I contacted him, and we shipped wine. I had a feeling about this, and so I bought the wines, actually got them here, and a few friends of mine in Paris were like, these wines are great. And, from the first minute I tried them, his wines are just incredible. They really are. And there's not a lot of them, unfortunately. As always, we probably only get 300 or 400 bottles a year for all of Australia. It's not a lot, but I think lately he kind of has a bit of the X factor. I think Jean-Baptiste's wines are going to be, they're already kind of a little bit famous, but they really are. They stack up.
So despite only having a small number of Aussie producers in your portfolio, you've got a deep pride in Australian wine.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I'm Australian first and foremost, and all of my knowledge and my journey in wine has been here, except for when I've been traveling around. But my roots are all based here, and I've made so many winemaker friends from Australia. It's just that I think you've got to focus on something if you want to do it well. It's hard to do everything at the same quality. I don't think I'd be able to run a business the way I want to, which is quite small, and have 50 Australian winemakers and 50 or 60 imported winemakers. That's 100 people to work with. So I decided early on, the name of my business is Andrew Gard Wine Imports. So it's always been about the imports, but I could never say no to not working with Australian wine. And the ones that I work with now, the 4 that I have, I'm deeply friendly with. So, they're serious friends of mine. Dan Standish in the Barossa Valley was the winemaker at Torbreck when I started in Torbreck in 2001. And I had to work in the Barossa Valley away from Sydney for 4 months. When I first started, I didn't know any person in the Barossa Valley. I had to make friends, and he introduced me to pretty much everyone you'd ever want to meet in the Barossa. He was really great to me, and we became fast friends, and he's got incredible taste in wine. His cellar is insane and tastes all around the world. I think it's one of the reasons his wines are so damn good. And so for me, it's like a brother, and I feel, very, very lucky to work with him. He probably doesn't need an agent. He sells everything he makes in 5 minutes, but I'm glad he sends me some bottles to sell. And likewise with Richie Harcum in the Hunter Valley, close to Sydney. He's my closest winemaker I work with. He's a lifelong friend, and I get up there when I can. I've seen his journey grow, and he's invested a lot of money in his cellar door and in restaurant facility recently. He's got beautiful panorama of the vines, and every year he tweaks what he does. He travels and learns and listens, and he comes back and he just adjusts things ever so slightly, talks with his growers ever so differently, and you can taste it every year in the bottle. And, my customers, they love both of those winemakers very much. And those 2 guys, Richie has gone down and helped Dan doing a vintage because it's later in the Barossa than in the Hunter. So it's those little things are nice for me. And that's uniquely Australian, I think.
So what's your take on where Australian wine is heading?
Australian wine now, I don't think it's never been as interesting or dynamic. We still make so much volume of fine wine that's exported all around the world. We've got companies like Penfolds, which make incredibly great white wines from around the hills, and the Rieslings too. And we all know how famous the red wines are, and they're able to produce them at a volume that those wines can be appreciated and tasted all around the world. And then you have artisan producers tiny producers all through South Australia, through the hills, the Adelaide Hills, and you've got all the way through Gippsland, Macedon. It's nuts. You have as much of the natural wine scene as you have in France. There's lots of people doing that. I just think the layers and the level of quality is crazy. And I can't imagine what it would be like to write a wine list now, taking myself back, say, to 1998 when I was doing that. How much fun I would have been able to have back then, and what kind of wine list I would have been able to do, knowing how much you could choose from today compared to how much I could choose from then, and how all of my colleagues back then were all trying to scramble for the best of the best, which was so limited back then. And now there's so much choice. That's one of the reasons is what makes Australia, in my opinion, one of the top handfuls of places to eat and drink around the world. Definitely top 3.
So what would be a bottle you would take with you to France?
To show a Frenchman, well, I can say that I've taken Standish wine. I've taken Samiodi wine, which is a very small, great producer made of my Fraser from the Barossa. I've taken Hochkirch wine. I've taken Bas Philippe, taken Harkham wines from Richie. Richie's also taken them himself when he's come with me. It depends where I'm going. If I was going to Alsace, I'd probably take some of our Rieslings because Alsace is famous for that. If I go to the Rhone Valley, I'll take some Shiraz or some Grenache. If I was going to take Grenache, I would take it from Steve Pannell from McLaren Vale. He's a mentor and he makes incredible Grenache. And if I was going to Burgundy, yeah, for sure, I would take some Chardonnay. And, I work with a guy called Francois Mikulski, and he asked me, what's his Bas Philippe? I took him a bottle. He wanted to taste it, so I did. I'm always, if I can, I'll take 3 or 4 bottles in my suitcase, and I'll always bring 3 or 4 back. That's kind of the exchange.
So looking ahead, are there any untapped regions or styles you're currently curious about?
I have to say, Italy is an area that has, I think I read, and I could be wrong, but it's something like 800 different grape varieties. And we know, quite a lot of them, but there are so many. And it's a very mountainous area in Italy. They have a very interesting aspects and soil types. Look at the shape of the country. You have the snow in the top. You have Sicily in the bottom, the arid regions and things. Etna. It's a crazy place for growing grapes and making wine. And I think that area is definitely, there's a lot to discover in Italy. France is quite well known now. It's always been famous for its wine and gastronomy, and I think Champagne and Bordeaux would have to be considered the 2 most well-known wine regions in France. Switzerland could be interesting. Portugal could be interesting. The US makes a lot of great wine. The Australian dollar doesn't really help for us too much as importers at the moment, but the US makes a lot of really great wine. I haven't really looked at South America, but I have colleagues that do a great job there. I probably wouldn't get into South America, but then there's all sorts of, they must be able to grow grapes anywhere in the world. I've heard they grow grapes in Thailand. I know there's a guy that makes wine in Bali. They have 3 or 4 harvests a year there because of the weather. But when it comes to my business, for now, if I discover 1 new producer a year, I'm happy. If you talked to me 10 years before, I would like to find 3 or 4 new producers a year. But for now, 1 a year is good. We're adding to the list, but slowly.
What do you hope the next generation of importers and wine lovers take from your journey?
I think anyone would like to see the future improve, and if people could take from what I've done, I hope that they see that the way I've done things, and to try to be the best I can, an application of discipline and selection and tasting, to try to distribute my wines evenly and fairly, and to always make sure that we're servicing the market with the best possible wines from around the world, to add to the fabric that's already here, to add our way to the fabric, but to ensure that we're serviced with the great wines that we should have access to. I'm disappointed I sometimes can't buy as many as I would like to share over here. So some of the wines we get asked for quite a lot, and we can't find them for customers because they really come in tiny volumes. But at least they're here. And if people want to dig deep enough and hard enough, they can find them. But it's important to do a good job, not just to do a job. You have to do it well. And if you do that well, then you open up opportunities for other people to do it. If everyone did a shoddy job, the market wouldn't exist. People would walk away from it. They would drink other things.
Andrew, your journey from sommelier to shaping the future of Australian wine is inspiring. But now we're shifting gears a little into my final segment I call Half Glass Full. It'll close out with a bit of fun and flavour, okay?
Yeah.
Red or white?
More white these days.
Burgundy or Barolo?
Barolo.
Favourite underrated wine region?
Beaujolais.
France or Italy?
France.
Last wine you drank?
1983 Chateau Latour at lunch yesterday with a dear friend.
Importing, is it craft or chaos?
Craft. I have to say that after everything we've spoken about.
Favourite Australian wine?
I think we do Riesling and Chardonnay best in white grapes, and we do Grenache and Shiraz best in red grapes. Other than that, I'll get shot if I mention names.
How about a Sydney wine bar you could recommend?
Dear St. Eloise,
And what about a restaurant?
11 Barrack.
Favorite wine and food pairing?
That's a hard one. Man, there are so many good ones. But I think sushi omakase with red champagne.
Awesome. One region you're dying to visit?
Etna.
Most inspiring winemaker you worked with?
Pierre Gonol.
What's the weirdest wine trend you've seen?
The weirdest wine trend I've ever seen? I don't know. I haven't seen anything that's freaked me out too much.
Okay, and we'll finish with, in one word, wine is
Inspiring.
Andrew. Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on Behind the Wines. Your dedication to craft, your influence, and your pure passion for taste is something we're all proud to share with our listeners. And big thanks to Sonder Cafe for hosting us in here in Paddington. And to all our listeners, stay curious, stay thirsty, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Brent. Cheers. Thanks, mate.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Behind the Wines. A huge thank you for joining us. Your support means everything. Like a good wine, the best stories are meant to be shared. So make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, leave a comment, and let us know your thoughts on our socials. And go to our website for some more stories, special offers, upcoming events, and exclusive content. And special thanks to PS Wine Selections for your ongoing support. Until next time, cheers.